Hector Bain didn't say a word when he walked into Rowan Mercer's curing shed that October morning. He just picked up Elena's carefully labeled brine crocks, 3 weeks of her work, and carried them out one by one and tipped them into the mud. Every last one. "No woman runs anything on this mountain," he said, loud enough for every hand on the place to hear, "and no drifter girl is going to be the one to change that." Rowan stood 10 feet away and said nothing. Elena stood in the doorway of the shed, brine soaking into her sleeves and wood ash on her hands, watching everything she'd built these 3 weeks sink into the dirt. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She looked at Hector with a stillness that made grown men uneasy. And then she looked at Rowan, the man who'd hired her, the man who'd handed her the key, and she waited. He still said nothing. That moment, that silence, was the moment that nearly broke everything. If you have ever been overlooked, dismissed, or watched someone destroy what you built just to prove a point, stay with me. This one is for you. Let me take you back to where it started. To a cold curing shed on the side of a mountain, and a wrapped bundle of a dead man's journals. And the morning a gate opened, and a woman walked through it, who was not what anyone expected. The first thing Elena Brier noticed about the Mercer place was the smell. Not the cattle, not the pine coming down off the high country, not even the cold that had started biting the edge of every morning that week. It was the curing shed, that low, dark building set apart from everything else at the far edge of the yard. It smelled like something left to rot. Like wood that had given up. Like a room that hadn't been asked to do anything useful in a long time. She stood at the gate with her travel bag over one shoulder and looked at it a long moment before she looked at anything else. That told Rowan Mercer everything he needed to know about her. He just didn't know yet what it meant. He was fixing a fence post when she arrived, which was probably the most honest version of himself anyone could have caught. Sleeves shoved up, hands bleeding where the wire had bitten him twice, jaw set with the particular tension that comes not from anger, but from exhaustion pretending to be strength. He was a big man, dark hair well past his collar, and no hat on his head, the kind of man the mountains made and kept. He'd been at the post since before dawn. It still wasn't right. "You the one who posted in town," she called from the gate. He didn't look up. Depends who's asking. Elena Brier. She let herself through the gate, which he noticed, and crossed the uneven ground toward him without hesitating. "I'm asking about the curing position." He looked up then. She was younger than he'd expected, not young enough to be his daughter, but young enough that 2 of his hands were going to laugh out loud when they saw her, and he already knew it and already felt the small, dull ache of knowing he'd have to deal with that later. "You have experience?" "Enough, that's not an answer." "Then let me see the shed," she said. "I'll tell you what I know after I've seen what you're working with." He should have told her no. He'd been telling himself all week he needed someone with references, someone local, someone the men would respect without him having to stand over them and make them. He needed simple, and he needed fast, because winter in that part of the mountains didn't negotiate and didn't wait. Instead, he pulled the key off his belt loop and pointed. She took it without a word and walked to the shed, and he went back to the fence, and for about 4 minutes he almost convinced himself this was a perfectly reasonable thing to have done. Then he heard the shed door scrape open. And then he heard nothing. And then her voice carried back across the yard, clear and unhurried. "When did you last use this?" "Few years." "How many is a few?" He didn't answer that. She appeared in the doorway. "Miss Mercer, how many years?" "4, he said. "Maybe closer to 5. She looked back into the dark interior a moment. Then she looked at him. "And you're trying to lay in your winter meat starting when?" 3 weeks ago, he said, which was honest in a way that cost him something. She was quiet. Not the quiet of someone being polite. The quiet of someone doing arithmetic in their head and not liking the numbers. "I'd need full control of the operation," she said finally. "No interference. No second-guessing from the hands. No committee. You tell them I'm running it, or I'm not running it. That's the only way this works. You haven't even told me what your experience is." "My father ran a curing house in Wyoming for 31 years, she said. "I worked beside him from the time I was 7 until the year he died. I know salt ratios for high country. I know how to hold a fire in a bad chimney. I know how to cure game so it carries a family through a hard winter without turning. Venison, elk, bear, whatever your hunters bring in. And I can look at that shed and tell you it hasn't been cleaned right in longer than you're admitting." She paused. "Do you want me to tell you what I know, or do you want to argue about whether I know it?" Rowan pulled the wire tight on the fence post, let it go, and watched it spring back crooked. He'd been fighting that post 2 hours. "You're hired," he said. He told himself it was a practical decision. Because she knew what she was talking about. Because the winter stores were already behind. Because he didn't have a better option walking through his gate. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she reminded him of someone he used to be. Someone who walked into a broken thing and said, "I can fix this," before they'd done the math, before they knew the cost, back when certainty still felt like something solid to stand on. He'd lost that somewhere in the last 5 years. He wasn't sure he could afford to let it back in. He handed her the key anyway. The first thing Elena did in that shed was not start working. She stood in the middle of it 20 minutes with a lantern, touching the walls, checking the chimney draft with a strip of cloth, pressing her thumb into the wood at the base of the hanging racks to test for rot. She looked at it the way a doctor looks at a patient just handed to them. Not assuming, not rushing to a verdict, just listening to what the structure was telling her. What it told her was not good. The flue had a partial blockage 6 feet up. 3 hooks on the east rack were rotted through and would drop whatever you hung on them the moment heat and weight and moisture got involved. The salt shelves were built at the wrong height for real work. Whoever built them had never done the work themselves. And the floor had a drainage fault that would turn the whole place into a swamp the first time she got a serious brine going. None of it was unfixable. All of it was going to take time she didn't have. She had one thing of her father's, and she'd set it on the clean end of the workbench before she touched anything else. A bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a leather cord worn soft at the knot. Inside it were his journals. 31 years of Thomas Brier's handwriting, every ratio, every fire, every failure, every correction he'd ever worked out in a life nobody but Elena had thought to save. She carried them everywhere she went, wrapped the same way he'd wrapped them. Because his knowledge had died with him, most of it. And the parts she'd absorbed were the only parts left, and she was not going to let the same thing happen twice. The oilcloth had been his idea, not hers. He'd wrapped those books against damp and smoke and the accidents of a working life for as long as she could remember, and when he was dying, he'd made her promise 2 things: that she'd keep them dry, and that she'd never let them sit somewhere they'd be forgotten. She'd kept the first promise easily. The second was harder than it sounded. A book only stays unforgotten if someone keeps opening it, and for a while after he was gone she hadn't been able to open them at all. The handwriting was too much like hearing his voice in an empty room. It was 2 years before she could read a page without her throat closing. By then, she'd learned to treat the reading as work rather than mourning, and the work had saved her the way it usually did. She untied the cord, opened the oldest journal to the page on compromised chimneys, his own hand, dated a winter 20 years gone. A small diagram in the margin she'd looked at 100 times, set a stone on the corner to hold it, and went to work. What she got when Rowan sent a hand named Dale to help that first afternoon was a man with 40 extra pounds of opinion and about 30 seconds of patience for being told what to do by someone he'd never seen. Dale was in his 50s, had worked the Mercer place 11 years, and made it clear inside 2 minutes that he considered this arrangement somewhere between insulting and absurd. "You want to run that chimney brush yourself?" he said, looking at her the way you'd look at a woman who'd announced she meant to shoe the horses with her bare hands. "I want to watch how you do it," she said, which was a lie, but a useful one. Dale ran the brush. Elena watched. What she was actually watching was how the blockage broke, which way the debris fell, whether the draft shifted the way she expected. Dale thought she was deferring to him. She was taking inventory. "That's your trouble right there," Dale said, pulling the brush down and looking at the mess of built-up creosote on the floor. "Hasn't been brushed in, Lord, years, 4 or 5, Elena said. "Smells like more." "It does," she agreed. "You're right about that." Dale looked at her. He'd been braced for an argument, and she'd taken it away from him, and he didn't quite know what to do with that. She handed him a broom. "Can you sweep while I start on the rack hooks?" He swept. He didn't love it, but he swept. That was the first small thing, the first piece of cooperation drawn out not by authority, but by the careful handling of another man's pride, which Elena had been doing since she was 9 years old, helping her father get along with men who didn't believe in either of them. There were 4 hands besides Dale. Pete, young and mean in the small-time way that comes from never having been seriously challenged. Hector Bain, older and meaner in a way that had been cultivated over decades, and who wore a kind of authority Rowan had never quite gotten around to confronting. And Cal and Jerome, who mostly went whichever way the group went and held no strong opinions of their own. Hector was the one to watch. Elena had him marked within her first 2 hours on the place. Not because he said anything. He didn't, because he was the one standing a little back from the others, arms crossed, watching her with the particular look of a man who has already made his decision and is only waiting for the moment to act on it. Her father used to call it a man who's decided the outcome before the game starts. He wasn't wrong. She kept working. The first week was the shed itself, cleaning it, repairing it, making it fit to use. She worked from first light to well after dark, and mostly alone, because getting Dale to help a second time took fresh negotiation. Pete flat ignored the one task Rowan gave him, and Hector never came near the building at all. Rowan checked in each evening. She kept her report short. The hooks on the east rack need replacing, not repairing. He put in the order. He made it fast, which surprised her a little, though she didn't show it. What she was starting to understand about Rowan Mercer was that he was a man who'd been making every decision alone for so long that he'd begun to mistake that for strength. There was a difference between a man who didn't need advice and a man who had simply stopped expecting anyone worth asking. She wasn't sure yet which kind he was. By the end of the first week, the shed was clean. By the end of the second, the first cuts of elk and venison were down in brine. She'd hauled the salt herself, driven the wagon to town herself, argued the price herself. Because asking the hands for help with something they considered beneath them would only be one more chance for them to prove it at her expense. There was more to it than salt and meat, and she'd known that going in. Game was harder than pork, leaner, wilder in flavor, quicker to spoil at the edges if you misjudged the cut, and every animal a hunter brought in was a little different from the last. A domestic hog was a known quantity. An elk that had run hard the day it was taken cured differently from one dropped clean and cold at first light, and a good curer learned to read those differences in the color and the grain before ever reaching for the salt. Her father had drilled that into her before she was 10. "The animal tells you what it needs," he used to say. "Your job is to shut up long enough to hear it." She'd hung green hides to cure alongside the meat, because a mountain ranch that wintered right didn't waste the hide any more than it wasted the meat. and a well-cured hide was money in the spring, when money was thinnest. The brine was right. She knew it was right before she measured it. The way you know a thing after enough years, but she measured anyway, because measurements were evidence, and evidence mattered when you worked among people looking for a reason to doubt you. She labeled every crock. She noted every ratio in her own book, kept in the same tight hand her father had used in his. Not because Rowan asked, but because someday someone might need to do this again. And she wanted it written down right. She wanted a record that said this is how it was done, instead of leaving it all in one person's head where it could die with them. That had already happened once. It was not going to happen twice. Rowan ate alone most nights. He'd been eating alone 3 years, since his wife Margaret packed her things and drove south and eventually sent a letter explaining she'd gone to live with her sister, which was a polite way of saying she'd had to choose between the ranch and herself, and had finally chosen herself. He didn't blame her. He'd expected to. He'd braced for anger or bitterness, some loud interior argument he could have with himself. Instead, a quiet had settled into the house and stayed, and he'd gotten used to it. That was the troubling part. He'd gotten so used to it that he'd stopped noticing when it got too heavy. On the 9th evening, he walked past the shed at dusk and saw the light still burning inside. He stopped. He could hear the soft, careful movement of someone working slowly, deliberately, not rushing. He knocked on the frame. "Come in," Elena said. She was at the bench with a cut of venison open in front of her, pressing her fingertips into the meat to check the salt's reach. She didn't look up. "Late to be at it," he said. "It's not late." "The temperature dropped, and I wanted to check the surface cure before I leave it overnight." "Is it good?" "It's exactly right." Then something crossed her face. Not pride, but its quieter cousin, satisfaction. The look of a person who expected the right result because they did the right work. "Do you want to feel it?" He wasn't expecting that. "Come here." Press 2 fingers. There, you should be able to feel where the salt's worked in against where it hasn't. Feel that? That's even. If it were uneven, you'd feel soft spots. He felt it. He didn't entirely know what he was feeling for, but he could sense the difference she meant, a slight change of resistance, subtle enough he'd never have caught it on his own. How long does it take to learn that? Longer than you'd think. Years, not months. He stepped back. She covered the meat and made a note in her book. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Why this place?" "My posting wasn't much. There are bigger outfits closer to town." She was quiet a moment, and he couldn't tell whether she was deciding whether to answer or deciding how, which were different problems. "Your posting said the shed had gone cold and you needed someone who knew what they were doing," she said, finally. "The others said experienced help wanted, good wages. Yours said you had something broken and you needed it fixed." She capped her pen. "I didn't want somewhere that already had a system. I wanted somewhere that needed one. My father always said that was the best kind of work, building something from nothing instead of inheriting somebody else's habits." "He taught you well." Something shifted in her face. Not grief, exactly, more the ghost of it, the place grief had been after it finally passed through. "He did," she said. He said goodnight and walked back to the house and ate alone. But the quiet felt different that night. Less like something missing, more like a pause before something begins. Hector made his move on a Thursday. Elena had been on the place 12 days. The salt stores were coming in, the brining was underway, the shed was working for the first time in 5 years. She'd tacked a schedule for the first smoking cycle to the inside of the door. Hector walked in, looked at it, and pulled it off the wall. "This isn't how we do things." Elena stopped, mid-adjustment, on a rack hook. "Put that back. You don't get to write orders on this ranch. You were hired to do a job, not run a department." Rowan gave me full authority over this operation. He told all of you. Rowan says a lot of things. And there was something in his voice that had been building 12 days. Something that had decided she was a problem to be corrected before she got any more established. He made a fool's hire. Sooner or later he'll know it. I'd as soon save him the trouble. He crumpled the schedule, dropped it, and went to the shelf of labeled brine crocks. 3 weeks of work. Careful measurements, documented ratios, and picked up the nearest one. Hector, her voice was flat. Don't. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had already decided and was just waiting for the reaction. He carried it to the door and tipped it into the mud. Then the next. Then the next. She counted. 5 crocks. Not all of it. But enough to hurt. Enough to set the schedule back. Enough to cost her real time. Rowan was at the fence. She could see him from the doorway. He'd heard Hector's voice and turned, and he was watching, and he didn't move. He stood with his hands at his sides, and she could see on his face the thing she'd seen a dozen times on a dozen faces, the calculation, the arithmetic of confrontation against comfort, of which battle to pick and which to let pass. He let it pass. He looked down and went back to the fence. Elena stood in the doorway with the mud swallowing 5 crocks of her work and made herself breathe. She looked at Hector. He looked back with something that was not quite triumph and not quite satisfaction, more like a man who'd done what he thought was needed and had already moved on from it in his own mind. "Are you done?" she said. "For now." He left. She stood there 1 more minute. Then she went back inside, opened her book, and started calculating what it would take to replace what she'd lost. She would not ask Rowan about it. She would not wait for him to fix it. She would fix it herself, and that would be the answer. And when the shelves were full at the end of all this, and the ranch had what it needed to live through the winter, the math would be clear, and no amount of spilled brine would change it. That was the thing about her father's work. It was all math in the end. The salt either worked or it didn't. The cure was either right or it wasn't. There was no room in it for a man's pride or his need to be the one in charge. Reality would settle it. She just had to get there. She replaced what Hector spilled by the next morning. She didn't sleep much. She ran the ratios in her head lying in the narrow bunk in the room off the barn. Ran them again because she was tired, and tired people make errors, then got up at 4:30 while it was still dark and cold enough to see her breath, and went back to work. Nobody saw her do it. That was on purpose. If she'd asked for help, it became a story about what Hector did. If she'd gone to Rowan, it became a confrontation, a taking of sides, a thing that split the crew into camps before she'd built anything solid. She'd seen that dynamic before, at her father's house in Wyoming and at the drying shed outside a mountain town where she'd worked 2 seasons in her 20s. The moment a new person makes their problem everyone's problem, they stop being someone who solves things and start being someone who has to be managed. She was not going to be someone who had to be managed. So she replaced the brine, relabeled the crocks in her tight, careful hand, adjusted the schedule by a day, and tacked the new one to the inside of the door. Same spot, same format. She did not look back to see whether anyone would tear it down again. She turned her back on it and went to work. Dale arrived at 7:30 with the look of a man who had heard things and wasn't sure what to do with them. He stood in the doorway a moment, taking in the bench, the crocks back on the shelf, the new schedule on the door. "You replaced it. Enough to stay on schedule." He scratched the back of his neck. "Hector's going to. I don't much care what Hector's going to do. Not with heat. Just as a fact. The way you'd state the weather. Are you here to work?" He looked at her a long moment with something she couldn't quite read. Then he pulled his gloves out of his back pocket. "What do you need?" That was the second small thing. She put him on the salting table and showed him how she wanted it. The layering, the coverage, the extra attention to the thick of the cut where the salt needed longer to reach. He watched carefully, and he didn't ask why the way he had that first afternoon. He just did it. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. But she noticed. Around mid-morning, Rowan appeared in the doorway. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the crocks. He looked at the schedule on the door. His jaw moved like a man working up to something. "Elena, I'm in the middle of something," she said, which was true. "I know. I just wanted to." "Miss Mercer," she set down the piece she was holding and turned to face him directly, because this needed to be direct. "What happened yesterday is done. I handled it. What I need from you right now is the replacement hooks for the east rack, which were supposed to be here 4 days ago, and to know whether the next delivery of green hides is still coming Friday." He blinked. "Friday? Yes, good, and the hooks? I'll see to them today." "Thank you," she said, and turned back to the table. He stood there another few seconds. She could feel it, and then he left. His boots went back toward the house, and she let out a slow breath and pressed both hands flat on the bench and stared at the wood grain for about 5 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. Then she picked up the next piece and kept going. Dale watched all of it and said nothing. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, the way a person's whole body changes when they start to revise their estimate of you. The hooks came Wednesday. Rowan brought them himself, which was not a thing the owner of a ranch usually did, and Elena noted it without making anything of it. She was replacing the rotted ones on the east rack when Pete wandered in. The young one, restless in the way of someone who hasn't yet worked out what kind of man he wants to be, and covers the not knowing with noise. "You know there's a particular way those go in," he said. "I do. Because Hector always said, 'How long's this rack been loose?' She didn't stop working." He thought about it. 2 years, maybe, since before I got here. "So Hector's way didn't hold," she said. Pete opened his mouth, closed it. She could almost watch the thought move across him, the urge to defend Hector, the recognition she'd made a fair point, the discomfort of both being true at once. "I'm just saying," he said. "Quieter. I know what you're saying." She tightened the last hook and shoved the rack hard to test it. "Solid. Better than solid. Hand me that cloth." He handed it over without thinking, then looked faintly annoyed at himself for having done it, which she found almost funny. "You can go. I've got it from here." He went. She leaned on the rack and thought about how little of this work was actually the salt or the wood or the fire, and how much of it was this, the constant, careful navigation of other people's insecurity. Her father had been good at it. She was getting better. She was not entirely good at it yet. There were still moments, more than she liked, when the anger rose behind her sternum and she had to choose, consciously, not to say the sharp true thing sitting right there on her tongue. Sharp true things said in anger cost more than they earned, even when they were right, especially when they were right. But holding them back had its own cost. It lived behind her eyes by the end of a long day. That night she locked the shed and walked to the barn in the dark and sat on the edge of her bunk and ate the cold biscuit she'd saved from breakfast, because she'd missed supper again. And she thought about her father's hands at the end of a working day, red and strong and mapped with the small cuts and stains of the work. And she felt something that was not quite loneliness and not quite grief, just a want. A wish that she could show him this shed. Show him the schedule on the wall and the full crocks on the shelf. Hear him say the thing he used to say when a job was going right. "Steady work, Ellie, steady work." She finished the biscuit and went to sleep. Rowan started leaving a light on for her. She noticed it the third night, the lamp in the kitchen window still burning when she crossed the dark yard past midnight, where before the house had always gone black by 9. She didn't remark on it. Neither did he. But it was there the next night, and the one after, and she found she'd started looking for it on the walk back. The way you look for a thing you'd miss if it were gone. He took to walking out to the shed at dusk. Not always with a reason. Sometimes he'd stand in the doorway a few minutes as if the warmth of the fire was what he'd come for, and then say good night and go. Sometimes he brought 2 cups of coffee and sat on an overturned crate while she finished her evening checks, and they talked about the operation, about the mountain, about the shape of a life lived mostly outdoors and mostly alone. He was easy to talk to in the way that quiet, capable men sometimes are, asking little, listening close, never once trying to make her smaller than she was. One of those evenings he told her about Margaret. He said it the way men say things they don't usually say, pushing it out before it could stick. That she'd said the ranch swallowed everything, that there was never anything left over, and that she hadn't been wrong. "What happened to the shed?" Elena asked, after she left. He looked at her sideways, surprised by the turn. "She kept it," he said. "I didn't know that until she was gone. I thought it was the hands. It was her, mostly. She had her own system. I never." He stopped. "I never paid enough attention to know what her system was. By the time I worked that out, it was 3 seasons behind. There was something in that bigger than the shed, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. But it sat there on the crate between them, acknowledged, and that was enough." "You should ask people while you have the chance," Elena said, "what they carry. It matters. You don't get it back once they're gone." He didn't answer, but she thought he heard it. She lay awake a while that night, aware in the specific way you're aware of a season turning that something had shifted, and that she was still deciding what it meant. The first cut of smoked elk came out of the shed on a Tuesday, 3 days ahead of when she'd told Rowan to expect it. She'd pushed it. Not recklessly, but with the confidence of knowing exactly when the cure had done its work. The color was right. The texture was right. And the smell was right in a way that was almost architectural, structured and deep. Nothing like the flat smell of raw meat. Nothing like the rancid smell of a cure gone wrong. It smelled like a winter's stores done correctly for the first time in 5 years. She carried it to the house herself and set it on the kitchen table and told him to cut into it. She watched his face. It took him a moment, pressing his fingers to the interior the way she'd shown him, feeling for the evenness. And she saw the moment he felt what she'd been trying to describe. Something in his expression settled. Something that had been tight for a long time went a little less tight. That's right," he said. "Yes, how'd you know it was ready early?" "I checked it at midnight, and again at 4. It was there." He stared at her. "You went out at 4 in the morning to check on a piece of elk." "I went out at 4 in the morning to check this piece," she said. "The others aren't ready yet." And then he laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short, genuine, faintly helpless sound, like something had broken through a wall he'd been holding up a long time. It was the first time she'd heard it. She hadn't expected it to change his face as much as it did. She took the elk to the crew at the midday meal and set it in the middle of the table without ceremony and stood back. Pete took a piece first, because Pete always took food first, and chewed it and said, "That's good," in the specific tone of a man who hadn't expected to say it. Cal took a piece, Jerome, Dale, who already knew it would be good, and tasted it anyway with the honest appreciation of someone who hadn't had properly cured meat in years. Hector sat at the far end and did not take a piece. Nobody remarked on it, but Elena noticed that he was looking at what was on the table, and that his jaw was tight, and that for once he wasn't running the low, constant commentary that usually kept every man in the room oriented toward him. His quiet was a different quality than hers. Hers was a place to work from. His was a place to hide what was happening behind his eyes. She looked at him, exactly. 1 second. Then she looked away. The afternoon went better than any afternoon since she'd come. Dale showed her, unasked, where a cache of salt from 3 seasons back had been sealed away well enough to still be good. Pete stopped lounging in the doorway with his commentary and started actually handing her things, which more than doubled her pace. Cal and Jerome, who'd only ever followed the group's temperature, were now following a different one and didn't seem to mind. Hector stayed away from the shed entirely. She knew that wasn't finished. She knew the specific silence of a man who's made a decision and just hasn't found his moment. Her father had described that kind once. The ones who go quiet are more trouble than the ones who stay loud. She was watching for it. But for that one afternoon, in the particular slant of October light that made everything look a little more bearable, the shed was warm and the work was going right. And she let herself feel it without qualification. The town came at her before Hector did. Rowan rode into the settlement at the foot of the mountain on a Friday to settle accounts at the supply store, the kind of errand he'd been putting off, because settling accounts when you owe more than you've paid is an exercise in controlled humiliation. He came back with a set to his jaw she'd learned to read. She waited until after supper. He came to the shed at dusk and leaned in the doorway. "Gideon Walsh," he said. She didn't know the name. "Runs the big outfit east of here. 3rd generation. He was at the store when I came in, him and 2 of his men." He made a comment, a pause. Said a man who'd let his curing shed rot 5 years and then handed it to a drifter girl had no business calling himself a cattleman. Laughed about it. His men laughed. Store owner kept his head down. "What did you say?" "Not enough," he said. And then, after a beat, "That's not what bothers me most. What bothers me most is that 6 weeks ago, I might have agreed with him. The fire pulled at the draft. The light in the shed shifted. And now?" He looked at her directly. "Now I think Gideon Walsh hasn't seen the inside of his own curing shed in 20 years, because he's got people to do it for him. And he wouldn't know a right cure if you put it in his hand." "That's probably true," Elena said. "You should have said something more. In the store." He looked startled. He'd been expecting the softer thing, the reassurance people offer when they want to ease a man's guilt without making him sit in it. She wasn't going to do that. "But you know what you should have said now," she went on. "Which means you'll know next time. And there'll be a next time. Men like Walsh don't say a thing once. They say it until there's a reason to stop. What would give him a reason to stop?" She looked at the shelves, the hanging cuts, the rows of labeled crocks, the schedule tracking 37 days of work done before dawn and past dark and through one night she didn't like to think about yet. "Full shelves by the first hard snow," she said. "That'll give him a reason." The weather turned before the schedule was ready for it. The first sign came on a Monday night when the temperature fell 12 degrees in 4 hours. Elena woke at 2 in the morning, not to any alarm, she kept none, but because something in the quality of the air had changed, and her body knew it before her mind did. She was up and dressed and moving before she'd finished waking. Outside, the cold had gone predatory. Not the clean, sharp cold of an ordinary autumn night, but the pressing, deliberate cold of a system moving in, the kind with intention behind it. The sky was the wrong color for 2 in the morning, too bright at the edges, a dirty pale snowlight off cloud that had come in fast from the north. She ran the numbers crossing the yard. The shed fire had to be held in a specific range for the cure to hold and the finished stores not to freeze, a fine line between too cold and too hot. A hard frost arriving 4 or 5 weeks early could ruin everything not yet fully processed if the fire failed or the temperature swung too fast. She had close to 40% of the winter stores still in progress. She pushed the door open. The fire was low. Not out. The coals she'd banked at 11 were still alive. But barely, and the inside temperature had already dropped 6 degrees from where it needed to be. She didn't panic. Panic is what you do when you haven't been trained for a thing. She'd been trained for this. She built the fire back carefully, not fast, because fast meant uneven. And uneven meant spikes that could ruin the outer layer of a cure mid-process. She fed it in stages, watching the strip gauge she'd rigged at the chimney, working the damper, coaxing the heat up the way you'd bring a sick animal back, slowly, steadily, without startling it. It took 40 minutes to get it right. Then she sat on the stool by the fire and watched it. She hadn't brought her coat. She'd been moving too fast in those first minutes to feel the cold, but now that she was still, she felt it. The draft off the north wall, the chill that lived in the floor. She pulled her knees up and pressed her hands between them and watched the gauge and fed the fire, and did not go back for the coat. Because going back meant leaving the fire, and she was not going to leave the fire. 2 became 3. 3 became 4. Outside the wind rose, and then came the first ticking granular sound of sleet in it, which meant the storm was serious and moving fast. Around 4:30 she heard boots on the frozen ground. The door opened, and Rowan stood there in his coat, having woken and looked out his window and seen the shed light still burning, and made a decision about what it meant. He looked at her, at the fire, at the gauge. "How long have you been in here?" "Since 2. He came in and shut the door. What's the situation?" "Drop came in fast. If I hadn't caught it at 2, we'd have lost the middle rack, maybe more. As it is, we're fine. 30 more minutes, and I'll know for certain." He pulled a second stool from the corner, a 3-legged thing she'd never seen him use, and set it by the fire. "Then, I'll wait the 30 minutes with you." He wasn't asking, and he wasn't offering. He was stating a fact, the way she stated facts, as information, not sentiment. "All right," she said. They sat without talking. The sleet hit the roof. The fire breathed. She got up twice to check the stores, and he watched the unhurried way her hands moved through the routine and said nothing. At the end of the 30 minutes, she pressed her fingers into the last 2 pieces on the middle rack and held them there and felt what she needed to feel. "We're good." He let out one slow breath, controlled, but she heard it. He stood and looked at the shelves a long moment. All of it. The hanging cuts and the crocks in their rows and the careful labels and the months of her father's knowledge worked into the bones of this building on this mountain in this terrible early winter. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. He seemed to be working on the right words and not finding them, which was not unusual for him. "I know," she said. He nodded. "I'll get coffee. Don't argue with me about it." She almost smiled. I wasn't going to. He woke Dale, who came out with his gloves and took the fire watch at 5 so Elena could sit down properly. She was asleep on the stool by 5:30, her back to the wall, chin dropped before she knew she'd gone. When she opened her eyes, it was full light, grey-white under the door, and Dale was at the fire and Rowan was on the other stool, awake, holding an empty cup, watching her the way people watch someone sleep when they think they won't be caught. He looked away when her eyes opened. She got up and went through every piece on every shelf, methodical. The same as always, not faster because she'd slept, not slower because she was still tired. All of it was right. "We didn't lose anything," she said. Dale made a sound that was somewhere between relief and satisfaction and sat down heavily on a crate. Rowan looked at the shelves a long time. Then, at her, "I owe you more than I can say right now." She shook her head. "You owe me the rest of the salt order and that bracket from the smith." He almost laughed. "I'll get them today." She found out about the debts from Dale, who let it slip the way people in small places let things slip, sideways, in the middle of a conversation about the east fence and whether it would hold the winter. Mercer can't afford another bad year. Then his eyes went sideways in the way that says I've said more than I meant to. 4 bad years in a row, he told her, once he'd started. A good part of the herd lost to an ice storm 3 winters back. Feed prices through the roof before that. And then Margaret going. Not that that was money. But things fell apart in a particular way after. Things he'd been holding together started coming apart. The shed among them. She thought about that later, alone with the evening fire. She thought about Rowan handing her the key at the fence post without much negotiation, without demanding proof of what she claimed. She'd read it as fatigue, or desperation, or bad judgment. Now she was rethinking. Maybe it was simpler. Maybe it was a man who'd stopped trusting his own judgment and was making decisions from a place that no longer felt like solid ground. She knew that place. Not from ranching, from the years after her father died, when she'd had to learn how to be in the world without the person who'd taught her everything about it, and had made decisions the same way for a while. Fast, and from a desperation she'd dressed up as confidence. She'd gotten better. She'd had to. Hector came to the shed that night. She knew his step by now, heavier on the right than the left. She didn't turn from the bench. "I know you're in there," he said. She put on her coat, picked up her book, and opened the door. He stood a few feet back, arms not crossed this time, hands loose at his sides, which was somehow worse. Crossed arms were defensive. Loose hands meant a man had already worked through his argument and arrived somewhere settled. "I want you to understand something," he said. Not loud, not the performance of that first morning with the audience. This was private, and he'd chosen it that way, which told her something. The public version had been about dominance. This was about something else. "I've been on this ranch 9 years. I've kept it running through things you don't know about. I've had Rowan's back when nobody else did. I believe you," she said. He stopped. He'd been braced for something else. "I'm not here to take your place," she said. "What I'm doing is in that building. It has nothing to do with your standing on this ranch. It has everything to do with my standing. When a stranger walks in and the boss hands over authority like it's nothing, it says something about what he thinks of the men already here. Or it says he was desperate and made a practical choice," she said. "That doesn't mean what you've built here doesn't matter." He studied her a long moment. "You're smooth. I'll give you that. I'm tired. Honestly, I'm not smooth. I'm just trying to get through a great deal of work in very little time, and I'd rather do it without fighting you. But I'll do it either way." Something in his face gave. Just a fraction. The way ice on a river looks solid until you get close enough to see it moving. "The crocks," he said. "The ones I spilled. Replaced. We're on schedule." He looked at her another long moment. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to, and didn't need him to. What she needed was for him to stop, and she could see the calculation happening, the same one she'd watched in Dale's face, in Pete's, in every face that had been set against her and then had to contend with what she was actually producing. He turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse. She went in and wrote her notes by lantern light, and in the margin where she tracked the state of the operation, she wrote 2 words that had nothing to do with salt or fire. Turning point. She wasn't sure she was right. She wasn't sure she was wrong. She closed the book and banked the fire and went to bed, and outside the first real cold of the season settled in from the north, the kind that meant business, the kind that said winter would not wait on anyone's schedule. The turning point turned out to be real, but it didn't look the way she'd pictured. She'd expected Hector to stay out of her way, and he mostly did. What she hadn't expected was the rest of the town. The supply order came up short that week. Flour delivered, salt not, and Dale's explanation hedged in a way that meant somebody hadn't wanted to fill it. The smith delayed a bracket 3 times with reasons that didn't quite hold. And a woman stopped Elena on the road when she drove in for supplies and told her, with the specific kindness of someone delivering bad news in a friendly register, what people were saying. That she'd taken advantage of a man in a bad spot. That she'd made herself indispensable to a widower who didn't have the sense to see it. That Gideon Walsh had been talking to the eastern ranchers about whether Mercer could be trusted to run a proper operation and suggesting the spring cattle contracts might go elsewhere. The spring contracts were the income that kept a ranch alive between seasons. The thing you could not afford to lose. Elena thanked her and meant it. She drove back and did not tell Rowan yet. Not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to think first, needed to bring it to him from the right angle. Rowan was a man who took problems personally, and a problem taken personally stops being something you can solve and becomes something you have to survive. She needed him solving, not surviving. When she did tell him, days later, he was quiet a long while. "Walsh is organizing something," he said finally. An informal meeting of the eastern ranchers, under the cover of spring planning. What he's actually doing is making his case against this ranch before the contracts go out. "You're going?" "I'm going." "Good," she thought a moment. "Take the records. Mine. All of them. Every ratio, every reading, every note on what worked and what didn't. And take a cut of the smoked elk. The first one, I kept it whole. She'd wrapped it and set it aside weeks ago, waiting without quite knowing for what. Now she knew. Numbers on a page tell a man one thing. His own hands and his own mouth tell him another. Let Walsh's people handle it. Let them smell it and taste it. Walsh is going to ask, who wrote these? He said. He'll say a woman's records don't. Tell him anyway. And when he says it, you show him the elk. He looked at her a long moment. You've done this before. My father had a competitor once. Man went around to every buyer in the county saying my father's operation was substandard, that he didn't have the experience, that they were taking a risk. She picked up her pen. My father invited him to come and taste the product. He sent a representative instead. The representative ate. He went back and told the man what he'd eaten. The man stopped talking. She paused. It's never simple. But the product doesn't lie. That's the whole advantage. Everything else, the talking, the politics, who said what, all of that can be twisted. What you taste is what it is. He went on a Thursday and came back at dusk, and he looked different. Not triumphant, she'd have been suspicious of triumphant. Quieter and more solid. The look of a man who has stood in a hard room and come out of it knowing something he hadn't known going in. Walsh didn't expect the records, he said. Said what you told me he'd say, about the source. I didn't argue. I put the elk on the table. His own foreman cut into it. Walsh tried to wave it off. Said it wasn't relevant, and the foreman cut into it anyway. He stopped. And something in his face was very careful. 3 of the eastern ranchers asked how long the operation had been running. I told them 6 weeks, including setup. 2 of them want to talk about the spring contracts directly. Not through Walsh. Directly with this ranch. She set down her tool. Walsh's foreman asked for your name, Rowan said. He wrote it down. He was quiet a beat. I should have learned it properly the first day, instead of calling you the woman to Dale for 2 days before I stopped. I didn't think about it until later. It wasn't a small thing. You know it now, she said. I do. Elena Brier. He said it like a complete sentence, which it was. Winter came down hard and early and did not let up, and the ranch was ready for it, not by luck, but by 6 weeks of work done right, against resistance, by someone who knew what she was doing. The shed held. The stores held, and the crew held, which meant Elena wasn't fighting the season alone inside the building while people slept. Pete ran the temperature checks through the worst night. Dale took the morning cycles. Hector cleared the snow load off the roof one morning without being asked, the kind of thing that doesn't need acknowledging, and got it anyway. She told him it was the right call. He said he knew. They moved on. And somewhere in the middle of that long freeze, the thing between her and Rowan stopped being a thing she was deciding about and became simply true. It wasn't a single moment. It was the lamp in the window. It was the second stool by the fire. It was the way he'd taken to reading her records at night, all of them borrowed off the shelf, working through the damper logic on his own, so that if she were ever sick or hurt or gone, the operation wouldn't die in the room with her. It was the evening she looked up from the bench and found him already looking at her, and neither of them looked away, and the silence changed quality the way the air changes before weather. "I came here to do a season," she said. "That's what I told you the first week. I meant it. I know. I don't say things and not mean them. It's a hard habit to be around." "I've noticed," he said. "I like it." She set down her pen. "That's the trouble." He crossed the shed. He wasn't a man who made a production of anything, and stopped close enough that she could see the small scar at the edge of his jaw she'd wondered about since October. "I've been a widower 3 years," he said. "I stopped expecting anything to come to this place that I'd want to keep. And then a woman walked through my gate with a bag over her shoulder and looked at my rotted shed like it was a patient she could save. And I've spent every evening since finding a reason to walk out here." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm telling you the light in that window isn't for the shed." Elena Brier, who had spent her whole life reading everyone in every room and had never once let herself be read in return, found she had nothing sharp and nothing careful to say. "Only the true thing. I know it isn't," she said. "It's why I look for it." He didn't reach for her, and she didn't reach for him. Not yet. Not that night. But the not reaching had changed. Where before it had been a wall, now it was a held breath. And they both knew the difference. Gideon Walsh came in person in the second week of December, knocked on the main house door on a cold Wednesday like an ordinary visitor. Rowan answered. Elena watched from the shed window and did not go to it. She went back to work. 20 minutes later, Rowan came to the shed. His jaw had the old tension, but it was a different kind. Not the tension of a man being pressed, but of a man who has just said something that needed saying and can still feel the shape of it in his mouth. "Walsh came to make an offer," he said. "Wants to buy the operation. Not the ranch, the curing, the contracts, the methods, whatever he'd need to copy it. And he wants to hire you directly. Through him. He came to poach." He didn't know about the partnership. She looked at him. "What partnership?" He held her eyes. "The one I'm about to offer you, so that the next time a man like Walsh drives up here, the answer isn't mine alone to give." He came in and sat on the crate. Not the ranch. The curing operation, the contracts, the methods, what it earns, equal split. You own the part you built. Because right now, if you leave, everything you know leaves with you, and I'm back to a rotted shed and a bad winter. That's not the right way to build a thing, and it's not the way I want to keep you." A pause. "The partnership's the practical reason. It's not the only one, and I think you know the difference by now." She was quiet a moment. She thought about the crew, about Pete asking to learn the chimney strip, Dale carrying the altitude ratio to Cal and Jerome, and getting a detail slightly wrong in a way that was forgivable. Because that was how knowledge traveled, imperfectly, person to person. Some of it lost, and some of it gaining something new in the passing. She thought about her father, whose knowledge had died with him except for the parts she carried, and how those parts were alive now in this building on this mountain, taken up by people who'd carry pieces of it forward. "A partnership means I'm here because I've got something to protect," she said slowly. "Not because I'm working a season with nowhere else to be." She looked at him. "I've done the nowhere else version. It doesn't end well. I'd only take this if it's the other kind." "It's the other kind," Rowan said. "On both counts." She put out her hand, the way you offer a handshake, like a partnership. He looked at it, and then he took it, and neither of them let go right away, and something passed between them in that grip, more intimate than a great many things that look more intimate. Two people who meant exactly what they were agreeing to. "We should write it down," she said. "We should." And Elena, he didn't let go of her hand. "I'd like the writing down to be the smaller of the two things we settle this winter." "I know you would," she said. And she didn't take her hand back. They told Walsh no. Rowan told him once, "The operation isn't mine alone to sell, and she isn't yours to hire, and you can get off my property." And said it a single time, not twice. Not after a long negotiation or the slow escalation she'd watched him avoid all autumn. Once, because it needed saying, and then it was done. Walsh went. He would make noise for a while yet, in town and at the eastern ranches, because men like Walsh always did. But he could not undo what had been built. He could not change what was in those crocks or on those shelves or in the notebook where his own foreman had written her name. He decided the outcome before the game started, her father would have said. And the outcome had not gone his way. The Eastern contracts were signed in February, Halverson and Doyle both, good terms, fair and sustainable, the kind that meant another season, and another after that. James Halverson had known her father's name, had bought, years back, from a man who bought from Thomas Brier, and remembered a particular way he had, with a shoulder cut. "That's your inheritance," he'd said, looking at her shelves. Part of it, she'd told him. The other part was wrapped in oilcloth, on a shelf now, no longer in a bag. Because she'd moved her things into the house by then, a room on the south side, empty since Margaret left, with a broad flat window that caught the morning light off the snow. She'd carried the journals up herself and set them on the shelf above the desk and stood in the middle of the room a while, because it was a room a person stayed in, and she had never once let herself put anything on a shelf she couldn't pack in 20 minutes. She'd had rooms before, in Wyoming, in 3 other places, and moved out of all of them without looking back. Because the work was done, and the next place was always ahead. She looked at her father's journals on the shelf. She'd carry those every time. Until she died. That was just the debt you took on when you were the last person who cared about someone else's knowledge. But they looked different on a shelf than they looked in a bag. In a bag, they were something you were carrying away from a place. Provisions for the next road. A dead man's voice you kept close because you had nowhere to set it down. On a shelf, in a room with your name on the door and a window that caught the morning, they were something else. They were a foundation. They were the first course of stone in a thing meant to stand. She had spent years reading them as a record of what had been lost. Standing in that south room with the snowlight coming flat off the yard, she understood she could start reading them. At last, as a record of what was being built. On a shelf, they looked like they had arrived somewhere. Rowan found her there at dusk, in the doorway, and she turned and looked at him, the man she'd read that first morning at the fence post as someone who had given up without quite admitting it, and had been wrong about, or right about, only the surface. He'd narrowed the gap between knowing and doing over the course of one hard winter. That was not a small thing. Her father had described that same gap in himself once, in a rare, unguarded moment. "I know what I should do, Ellie. I just wait too long to do it." She'd watched Rowan stop waiting. "The shelves are full," he said. "They're appropriately laid in for the season," she said. Full would mean we overstocked. He laughed, the short, helpless sound she'd first heard over a cut of elk, and crossed the room. And this time she did reach for him, and the not reaching that had stood between them since October finally gave way, the way ice on a river gives when the thaw has been coming a long time and everyone pretends not to feel it moving underneath. They were married in the spring, when the pass opened and the mountain went green to the ridgeline. In the yard, with the crew standing witness and a circuit preacher who asked no questions he didn't already know the answers to. Dale gave the bride away, having appointed himself to the office without consulting anybody. Pete cried and denied it. Hector stood at the edge of the gathering, and near the end, when people were saying their good nights, he came over and said, "Rough." Like a word he'd practiced and still hadn't gotten comfortable with, "Good work." And then, because that wasn't quite the whole of it, your father'd have been proud of what you did with that shed. Which was, from Hector Bain, a speech. She kept the journals on the shelf in the south room. She kept her own beside them now, 4 volumes and counting. The same tight hand, the same careful format, the record of a winter when a rotted shed on the side of a mountain had come back to life and taken a ranch and a widower and a hard-headed drifter with it. Her father's knowledge was alive in that building. Not exactly as he'd held it, passed hand to hand, some lost, some gained, but alive, and moving, and going forward. That was the work. Not the salt, or the smoke, or the fire. The work was making sure the thing didn't die with you. She had come through that gate in October with a bag over her shoulder and everything she owned inside it, certain the best she could hope for was to do the job and move on. Because moving on was the one thing she had always been reliably good at. She was not moving on. She had, at last, and against every habit of a hard and careful life, arrived somewhere. A mountain. A shed that smelled the way a shed was supposed to smell. A man who left a lamp burning in a window, and a shelf where a dead man's journals had finally come to rest. That was more than she'd carried in with her. It was more than she'd let herself want in a great many years. And she had stopped, at last, being afraid to want it. That was everything.